This is our fourth and final session of our 2021 Food Literacy for All series. My name is Andy Jones. I'm a faculty member in the School of Public Health at University of Michigan. And this year's Food Literacy for All series, this is the fifth year of the series, is titled The Politics on Our Plate. Our previous three sessions over the past months first focused on envisioning a future just and sustainable food system. And the subsequent sessions then centered on how we can organize communities and enact policy to realize that food system. We've had lots of amazing speakers guiding us through these topics, including Raj Patel, Ricardo Salvador, Monica Ramirez, Navina Khanna, Shirley Sherrod, and Samina Raja. If you haven't had a chance to see these fantastic talks, please check out the recordings of the sessions on our YouTube page, which maybe Ayana or someone can pop into the chat as we're moving along here for folks that maybe don't have it readily available. But this week we have an equally exciting session centered on communicating food systems issues to affect change. So we'll be getting that underway in just a moment here. As many of you already know, Food Literacy for All is a community academic partnership. So I'm joined in leadership this year by Lilly Fink Shapiro, who is the manager for the University of Michigan Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, and Davida Davison from Food Lab Detroit. Lilly will be moderating today's session, and we'll hear from Davida in just a moment to introduce our speakers for today. We're really glad you're all with us. We realize it's not the same sort of dynamic as in past years when we've been in person, but we're glad that we can all be together for this virtual format nonetheless, and we are able to have sort of a broader audience because of it, most likely having folks joining us from around the world. Just a couple of quick ground rules. We welcome your questions at any time point during the webinar. So just please type them in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll save some time at the end of the hour to get to them. You can discuss with each other via Twitter using the hashtag Food Literacy for All. And we also want to just gratefully acknowledge the support for the webinar series this year from the Francis and Sydney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund of the Center for the Education of Women. So with that, I will pass it off to Davida for some introductions of our speakers for today. Thanks so much.
Okay, am I on?
Yeah, we can see you, Davida.
Can you guys see me?
Yes. Okay,
fantastic. I'm not sure. I'm having a little, I think I'm, oh, here I am. Okay. So happy to be with all of you. This is our last session, and so many of you all have been with us from the very beginning. My name is Davida Davison, and I'm the Executive Director of Food Lab Detroit. And it's so wonderful to be here with you all as we kind of wrap up our Politics on a Plate with two of my favorite food writers. And it's such a pleasure to bring to this discussion both Leah Douglas and also Patricia Escárcega. Patricia, I knew I was gonna mess up with your last name. Could you pronounce it for our audience, please? I'm so embarrassed and I'm so sorry.
Please don't worry about it, Davida. I have issues with it sometimes myself. It's Escárcega.
It's Escárcega. Thank you so very much. I did not want to mispronounce your last name, so thank you for being so gracious. And Leah is an amazing journalist. She covers the business and the politics of food. That's why this is a perfect conversation for both of them as we wrap up the politics on our plate. Leah is a hard-hitting reporter. She lives right outside of DC, and she writes all about food at the intersection of corporate consolidation, environmental issues, racial discrimination. I mean, her work is phenomenal. And some of the work she did during the pandemic, as we do see some light at the end of the tunnel, but Leah really shined a light on this. And I think Leah also received recognition and award for her COVID-19 mapping project that she did. So just phenomenal work from Leah. And so thank you so much, Leah, for joining us. And Patricia, I mean, her work is amazing as well. Patricia is currently, I think, Leah, you're at the Fern currently. Patricia is currently at Counter, but has most recently worked as a food critic, food writer for the Los Angeles Times. She has also worked for the Baltimore Sun, the Arizona Republic as well, Patricia. So her writing is vast as well, coming from writing about food at the intersection of the dining perspective, but also going to be writing, and I'm so interested. I think her first article for the Counter is coming out soon, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm really looking forward to that work as well. Patricia, you can talk beautifully about food on the plate, but one of the things I'm excited about your writing is you're going to take us behind the plate as well. And so I'm super excited to have both of you ladies joining us here today for what's going to be a dynamic discussion. So Lilly, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you, ladies.
Great, thank you, Davida. And again, my name is Lilly Fink Shapiro at the University of Michigan Sustainable Food Systems Initiative, if you're just joining us. And I'm just gonna reiterate that this is the last session, and that the first session we talked all about how do we create a vision for the food system. And then we're spending these last 3 sessions talking about how to get there. And this last session, which is all about food journalism in the media, and we're going to focus on what is the role of the media, and what is the role of writing and journalism in telling those stories about our food system, and what is the role, how can journalism contribute to food systems change. So all this talk about food journalism, I'm sure there's some of you out there who are not quite sure what that is. And as we discussed the other day, it can mean maybe a lot of things. So I want to turn it to you, Leah and Patricia. So how do you define food journalism? What is it that we mean by that? Can we attempt to come up with some kind of definition for that to get us all on the same page?
And Leah, I'll go ahead and jump in if that's okay. To be honest, I don't have like a very clear definition. And I think we had sort of we kind of pre-gamed this conversation a little bit, and we thought that might be a good place to start, because I personally have always had trouble defining exactly what that means. And I think part of it's just because it's everything, isn't it? It's like immigration, it's the environment. And we kind of had a discussion about one of the most interesting phenomenons of like a daily newspaper is a lot of times there'll be a story and people don't know whether it belongs in the food section or like the business section, or so there's always been this sort of like fuzzy edge around food journalism, but I like to think of it as one of the more one of the greatest assets of being able to, and one of the great privileges of being able to report and write about food, is that it gives you an entryway into so many things. And one of the ideas that I think is out there, and that Leah and I discussed a little bit, prior to today, was the idea of there being kind of like this soft food journalism and more like hard news journalism. And if we're going to have like a spectrum, like Leah's on one end, and restaurant criticism, which is what I've been doing for most of my career as a journalist, is considered more on the softer end. So and one of the kind of ideas that I would like to put out there today is the idea of collapsing the difference between the two. Because if there's one thing that I think the pandemic showed us, is that kind of that analogy, I think I used one that I rely a lot on, is sort of like when you pull a string, on a like sweater, and then you see everything sort of unravel. And I think that's sort of what we saw, where if you compare a food section at a major daily newspaper, let's say a week before the shutdown happened in most places, and then you compare to the same exact section, the same set of writers, the same set of hearts, minds, ears, how wildly different the coverage was from one week to the other. So I think that there's this distance between us, but it's really a lot of it is very illusory. There's not really, there's this wall we've put up between us, and maybe it's time we, you know, start poking holes in that wall and maybe working together. And yeah, so that's sort of one idea that Leah and I have sort of been talking about. And I don't know, Leah, if you feel that maybe, you know, food journalism in general doesn't get sort of the, for lack of a better word, the respect that it gets. Is that something like maybe you feel as a journalist?
Well, it's such an interesting question because I think there's so many different ways of thinking about a field in the media industry that's relatively small. You know, there's so comparatively few people on this beat, either including everyone from the dining and restaurant, you know, to the extent that that's a side, and like the hard news side, as you said, there's still a relatively small ecosystem of people. And, you know, one of the things that was so interesting to observe this year, as you know, COVID just threw all these food system issues like onto the front page, was, you know, I saw a lot more interaction among all those different media voices, whether from the dining restaurant side or the hard news side, and engaging with each other's work, understanding how, you know, labor issues in restaurants are connected to the meat supply chain, and all these things are engaging in one sort of policy and reporting conversation if you look at it broadly enough. And so I think that was, you know, really important, and I hope, you know, that can continue as we're sort of the immediate crisis of COVID is receding, but we're going to see these really long, this really long tail of the pandemic, right, affecting workers in the space and suppliers, and we're going to keep seeing the same types of issues over, you know, for who knows how long. So I mean, I think when I conceptualize with my work as a food journalist, you know, I see myself as sort of straddling business journalism, but also bringing in pieces from the labor beat and from the immigration beat and from the dining side. You know, I see it as important to my work that I understand and have some literacy in all those areas, because, you know, I do see them as all connected. But I do think that it's a sector of reporting that is generally under-resourced and underexpressed in newspapers, and there's a lot of independent media in you know, food and farm journalism, which is really incredible, which the Counter and Fern are, you know, both colleagues in. And you know, it's I think at the beginning of the pandemic, it was clear to me that a lot of the big papers and the biggest magazines just didn't have the in-house knowledge to cover some of these really acute issues that came up either on the restaurant side, the supply chain side, or, you know, what was going on in meatpacking plants and on farms, you know, and I think it was to the detriment of understanding the full scope of the issue, that's the case. And we could always, you know, always see more investment in food journalism, however defined.
Mm-hmm. And so thank you both for your perspective on that. And now we have sort of an understanding or grounding of what we mean by food journalism in this wide spectrum. I want to dive into more like, what is the power of it, and especially the power in transforming our food system. So Patricia, I wanted to lift up something that you said when we were talking the other day, which is you said that sometimes you were describing food journalism as a powerful lens that's really accessible and that it can draw people in. And so you might draw people in, you said, by writing about a taco, but wind up talking about issues of immigration. And I wanted to see if you can just elaborate on that a little bit more and bring us more into your thinking on that, or bring us more into your goals with a writing. And I think a lot of us probably don't think of food critics as having that kind of power. And also what Davida Davison was saying about, you know, going behind the plate. And can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Some of your goals or intentions?
Yeah, of course. Sort of touching on one of the things you mentioned, which is sort of the power, for lack of a better word, to affect change through food journalism. I think one of the things we're seeing right now a lot in the news cycle, and I'm glad to see more coverage that's getting fuller, but the labor shortage that's happening in the restaurant industry, it's a big thing. I'm working on a story, you know, and everyone I've interviewed, it's not about labor, but I mean, everything's sort of about labor, isn't it? And but everybody's mentioned like, oh, I'm restricted from doing, you know, this kind of menu because we're so short-handed right now. And I think that first wave we saw of stories about restaurants being short-handed was really frustrating because there were a lot of shorter news items, but they were very poorly sourced in the sense that they still only talked to, you know, restaurant owners and people who own businesses, which is obviously very important. That's central to the story. But, you know, of course, we all know every story has many angles, has many sides. So if there's someone telling you, you know, I don't have enough hands here, what's the other side of that story? And that side, there's other people that are a part of that story, which is the people who work in the restaurant and who, you know, for whatever reason have not gone back to the positions they were doing before the pandemic. And so I think, you know, even though there seems to be this firewall between something like restaurant criticism and writing a story about labor, in fact, they're really intimately tied. So I think one of the central challenges that I see, you know, facing us in food journalism is how to reckon with those kind of questions. And going back to your example, we were talking about, you know, I was saying that food is such a great lens because it's a really sneaky lens, because you could start off writing about a taco and then you could end up writing a story about immigration or, you know, regional foodways or what have you. But one of my frustrations with the way we've sort of siloed restaurant criticism is that food doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Where it's not, it's the end, when I go to a restaurant and I order a dish, it's the end product. It's the final, you know, manifestation of itself, but someone had to grow the food, someone had to harvest the food, someone had to figure out how to distribute it so that it would end up, you know, on a table in front of me. Someone had to cook it. Someone had to conceive of the idea to put it on a menu and sell it to people. So it feels really limiting to me when we only write about like that final product, which also happens to be like the most, you know, pleasing in a way and the least, or the most glamorous part of the whole food production, you know, system. So yeah, I just think that one of the, you know, very profound lessons from the pandemic is to realize that food isn't in a vacuum, and that no matter what kind of journalism you're doing, to keep that in mind, you know, moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely echo everything that Patricia said. And, you know, I think I was just reflecting as you talked, Patricia, about when I was first starting out as a food blogger a long time ago, back when blogs were a thing. I think the main way that I understood my writing was that to get people to care about food, like people care about food because they eat, right? Everybody eats. That was like the cliche of why among sort of people who wrote about food, and we're going to capture people's attention because this is something you do multiple times a day, and you know care inherently about where that food comes from, sort of linked to like the locavore movement. And when I was sort of coming into the food universe, that was the sort of way of thinking du jour. And I think over time, as my work has become more structural, more power analysis oriented, and also as the world has changed, the context of the country has changed, you know, I think more about a reader, how do readers see themselves reflected in the stories? What are we assuming readers are interested in? And how does that show up in the work? You know, I think that one of the things that I see as a value now around the power of food journalism is people care about structural inequality as a value. They want to learn more about money in politics. They want to learn more about corporate consolidation. These are issues that have become, even in the last 5 or 6 years, just more of the day-to-day discussion in people's lives, and people are affected by it. Writing a story about labor, and you only interview an employer assumes that the people reading your article are going to resonate with an employer. If you are instead sourcing primarily from workers, right, that's a different perspective shift, where you might be reaching people who see themselves reflected in the experience of a low-wage worker, not in the experience of a employer. So I think that when I see, food systems work as a vehicle for anything, it can be a vehicle for these discussions about power and politics just as much as, there's still so much space. In addition to that, sometimes I feel like the bummer, I go to the party and I'm like, here's all the bad stories about everything you're consuming, and nobody wants that all the time. There's so much space for the joy and to appreciate, the end product, like you said, Patricia, right? And I think that what I've learned through getting feedback from readers and seeing, especially in this past year, how these stories about, supply chains and workers resonated with the general public is there's appetite to learn about this that isn't just through the lens of a finished product. So I think the power is only growing from that perspective.
And Leah, I want to kind of continue on a thread that you brought up, which was, and who your audience is and who it resonates with. If your audience resonates with more of, you were saying, more of a worker, more of the labor side of things, or more of the employer, of the boss. But it connects to a broader question for me, which is about who, I guess this connects to the food movement overall, because sometimes in the food movement, it can feel like we're talking to ourselves and the audience stays the same. And both in your positions, it seems like you're both in positions that could potentially break through that, right? And through media and journalism, you can get outside the bubble that some of us feel like we're in. So my question is, I guess, do you feel like you are talking to already this kind of food movement bubble group, or are you beyond, do you reach audiences beyond that? And the second part of that is just, how do you break through? How do you create work that goes beyond the choir?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's definitely one that I think about a lot, and I'm always learning around. I think, at Fern, I think we kind of straddle multiple audiences, because we have one audience that is, maybe professionals in food system work, really wants the day-to-day updates on policy issues, and so that's one type of work that may not have, all the context that a general reader might need to understand the latest update, whether it's, around the Farm Bill or whatever other piece of federal policy is moving ahead. And we also do a lot of work where we try to reach the general audience and fill, a gap that might exist in a magazine or newspaper that doesn't have a staff writer looking at, big structural food system issues. I think this past year was really informative around how much of a reach these issues can have, with the work I was doing on data collection around COVID cases in the food system and outbreaks, and doing some reporting from that on how employers are responding to the pandemic. That story was front page news for months, and there was a very high level of understanding in the general public that, this sector of workers, that all essential workers, but including food system workers, were really disproportionately affected. So I think that was a great example of how, there is that potential to break through and make it to, a general audience. Obviously, there's, hopefully we're not going to have a story of that magnitude of crisis every year. But, I think that was really an infusion of new interest and energy that I hope can continue now that folks have, more baseline understanding for the sector.
And Leah, can you give just a quick background on some of that reporting that you did, in case there's folks who are with us who missed Davita's intro, or who don't know about all of your COVID food system labor reporting?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So I've been maintaining a database for almost 15 months, excuse me, that's tracking outbreaks of COVID at farms, food processing facilities, and meatpacking plants, and how many workers have contracted COVID and died from COVID at those types of facilities. So that's sort of the center point. And I've done a lot of analysis out of that data of, cases, how the case trends have changed over time, which employers are, you know, the best and worst actors, what are some of the, what's happening in the policy ecosystem to respond. So that was the primary work that I did during the pandemic.
Thanks, Leah. Great. So I'm going to pivot us a little bit here, although it's still connected. So I'm wondering, and it seems, Leah, like your work that you were just describing would definitely fit into this, but I'm wondering if you can point to examples of your own work or else, you know, other writers' work that you admire. Are there instances that you can think of where reporting has been so powerful that it has fundamentally changed the food system in any ways, that it has really made an impact in the way that we operate, whether it's for on the labor side, on the really health, sustainability, policy, in any way? And I'd like to, it would be nice to hear some specific ideas if you have any.
Yeah, and I'll go ahead and jump in if that's okay, Leah. And so these are a couple of pieces that I've been thinking about lately, and I don't know, they're so recent that I don't know whether they will have, you know, the effect that I hope they do, or that they're able to affect some kind of change towards a more equitable food system. But I wanted to really note, and I'm going to be a little sneaky here and promote the counter, but my colleague Claire Brown recently did a really powerful 3-part series, how corporations buy and sell food made with prison labor. And I think the series did it's just such a good example of what we can do right now with food journalism, where Claire did a really wonderful job of using resources to produce a story that's not super expensive to produce, but which can have an enormous footprint, which is, you know, speaking very clearly about what's happening right now with coerced labor being used to increase profits. And she did a lot of like records requests, and I still need to like really pick her brain to, but it you know, and it's classic investigative journalism, but it really shows how there's so much information available to us. And if we take the time to really process it and, you know, really take a hard look at what's out there right in front of our eyes, right? And I think there's a great part in actually, if you don't mind, I wrote a really quick excerpt from it. She describes food production as a quiet set of business relationships that slip prison-grown food products into restaurant menus and onto supermarket shelves undetected. And then there, I think she asked the question, like, would we buy something if there was a label that said packaged in prison? And I think that's a really like powerful way, because it speaks to all of us. We all have to buy food, you know, we all go to the store, we want to buy fair trade coffee. And as Leah said, like, people have values and they want to live their values. But sometimes we don't even know, like, if we are living our values. And that role of that's one way that journalism can really step in and sort of help people, you know, give us a clear look at our food production system and how it works.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, what a powerful article. Maybe we can actually even drop, or did Davida already drop that one in the chat? I think so. Yes, thank you, Davida.
Yeah, that's an incredible series. So definitely recommend folks check that out and read everything on the counter. You know, I think I was sort of puzzling over this morning, trying to come up with like my, you know, one example to hold up of like, you know, this changed the world. And there are obviously like so many impactful pieces of journalism that have inspired me over the years. But what it really got me thinking about was the power that comes when there's like a snowball effect around a story that, you know, maybe one reporter or a couple of reporters identify, and this is thinking like through how the journalism process works, and then other newsrooms start to pick up. And I think it speaks to what we were talking about at the beginning of like, how can these different silos or these different approaches to the field, and even people who aren't in the beat, you know, who just come across the issue and want to report on it rigorously, all sort of support each other in moving forward some of these big ideas and pieces that otherwise might not break out. So I'm thinking about, you know, in 2017, I did some reporting, 2018, about heirs property, which is describes a type of property ownership where multiple members of a family have claim to the same piece of land, and it's kind of it's tricky to figure out who is the clear owner of the land. And this is an issue that particularly affects lower income landowners, and historically has been very common in the Southeast among Black families and also Indigenous families in Appalachia and so on. And there's many consequences to that land owning structure, one of which is that there's a lot of predatory development that happens of land, like predatory real estate deals to target families that have this kind of what's called like a weak ownership structure over their land. And you know, I did some reporting on it based in one community in South Carolina, and there was a story that happened at the New Yorker about it, and then there was a story that happened at ProPublica about it, and it slowly sort of steamrolled into, or snowballed, not steamrolled, into a broader conversation in the reporting field, and then it sort of stretched into there was, you know, an ongoing policy conversation at USDA about how to address these issues. And, you know, it always needs to be said, there had been people working on this issue for decades, right? No reporter came to this for the first time. There's always people who understand this in depth, but just thinking about the impact journalism can have, that was a great experience and example of how, you know, we can sort of support this idea getting more visibility. And I think the COVID reporting was another great example of you know, there was news being shared and cited and built upon in different newsrooms that might never have collaborated or might never have even come across each other, you know, because again, there's sort of like the farm reporting, and then there's the food business reporting, and then there's the dining reporting. But I think that collaboration, even just intellectual collaboration, you know, really allowed for this sort of the broader public to be more informed, right? So I think, I wish I had like a more concrete one piece, but you know, I think it's really to the credit of the field and working together when we can really have the biggest impact.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and it seems like, you know, in the food journalism world, it's reflective of food in many other aspects. Like, you know, I'm based at the university, and we struggle similarly at the university trying to get through that food is not just an issue that needs to be studied at the School for Environment Sustainability, and not just to be studied at the School of Public Health, and not just in urban planning or in policy or in business and more, but it's all of these. And it seems like that's maybe across sector is a theme with food, and that there's more and more realization of, just like how Patricia, how you started out talking about how you pulled the thread and it all goes. It seems like that resonates kind of across the field. I just want to acknowledge that we see some of the questions that have come in the Q&A box. So if you have sent in a question, thank you, because we're gonna, some of these we may be able to kind of pose throughout, and we're also going to try to leave some time at the end. So I just want to invite the audience, feel free to continue to pose questions if you have them. And I'm going to go next with a question from Kitty Opliger, who asked, how can technical or scientific information be communicated to the general public in order to provide details required for ethical personal consumption? And I'm guessing that this was inspired by that story, Patricia, that you shared about the counter and the conditions in prisons.
Yeah, I think that's honestly, one of the central challenges we have right now, because professionally, we are very much siloed still, where there's a lot of the onus is on a lot of individual journalists to really reach out. I don't think, at least in my experience, there isn't like a button that I could push and like get like the perfect, the statistic or the right bit of fact-based data, or I'm sorry, information that I need to write a story. So, and then there's the lack of resources in journalism right now, and the lack of not just money, but time for journalists to really take those deep dives and, you know, really be able to crunch large amounts of data and be able to take very technical information and, you know, be able to use it to tell stories and to illuminate, you know, parts of the food system that perhaps are not so well known or clearly defined. I think that's a big challenge, and I don't have a pat answer for that. I think a lot of it is just, you know, trying to open up, as you were saying, Lily, those interdisciplinary sort of avenues where I try really hard to reach out to the person who I think can give me the best, highest quality information. So if that means a chemist, if that means a farmer, if that means it's a, you know, a farm worker, instead of trying to sort of put something together with small amounts of information and, you know, relying on other people's reporting, that if we invest more in being able to connect journalists to other journalists, as Leah was saying, and to really start doing kind of cross-section collaborations and sort of building that into the system, baking it into the system so that it's not something that's one person has to work so hard to accomplish. I think it would just make journalism much richer, and maybe it would help us, you know, reach more people. And I'm sure, Leah, you have a lot of thoughts on this.
Well, it's actually an interesting time for me to consider it, because I'm working on a story right now that has to do with climate change, and it's like an area of coverage I haven't done a lot of technical work in. So I'm having to go through the learning curve of understanding. Like, I was just reading like a 600-page report that had all these equations in it. I was just like, how, like, I did not, the last time I took a science class was in high school. So how am I going to figure this out? And totally, I mean, the robust sourcing is obviously step one. And trying to find someone, you know, I'm always telling experts, you know, explain it to me like a layperson, you know, explain it to me like I'm approaching this for the first time, so that I can do that for my readers, you know. And I think sometimes there's a tension there, because there, you know, the act of trying to distill things into the simplified form is always going to leave some details aside, which, you know, some experts can struggle with, right? Because it's not capturing every nuance. But you know, one of the strategies, such as it is, that I use all the time is that I talk to the people in my life about what I'm working on, you know, every story, and I run ideas by people, and I try to explain it in a way that I think is simple and straightforward. And if someone's confused, I'm like, okay, I didn't do a great job of that. Let me try that again. And what questions do you still have? And, you know, there are people who aren't coming at this, they're, you know, coming at it for the first time. So I'm learning in those conversations what interviews I might still have to do and what gaps I still need to fill for someone who's not becoming an expert in it like I am as in the reporting process, or mini expert in the reporting process. So that's just like a tip that I rely on a lot, and, you know, endless gratitude to my many friends who, you know, hear about this stuff at length, whether they want to or not.
Right. Well, so how do each of you, you know, I've never been a journalist. I don't know, that's not true. High school paper, but that doesn't really count. How do you decide what to write about? You know, how do you decide what to write about? How do you decide your next story? And how much does that have to do with who you are working or writing for? And like, what, can you just take us behind the curtain a little bit and describe that process?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, a lot of it is sort of what's in the ether, is you know, what questions do I have? And if I have those questions, maybe someone out there also has those questions, or, you know, if I found something very compelling or moving, chances are other people have as well. And a lot of that is, you know, following your curiosity. And I've been incredibly privileged to work in places where that is an instinct that has been encouraged. And of course, there's times when you do a story because it has to be done, you know, there's a timeliness factor, or it's, you know, something that you've committed to, or it's some kind of project that happens annually. In the case of food journalism, you know, in restaurant criticism, there's a lot of structure there, in the sense that there's all this, there's a lot of reader expectation there about, you know, at the end of the year, you're going to get a roundup about the best things I ate this year. So those kind of stories, it's like you're thinking about them all year, you know, like, is this the best thing I ate? But yeah, a lot of it for me is really just taking the temperature. And you know, if I'm really interested in something, usually there's a food angle to it. So it's pretty, I have found that I have an abundance of ideas, because food is so central to being human that, you know, it's almost hard to not have ideas. Or my problem is more being able to, like, winnow it down to, like, you know, something that could be consumed in a newspaper or blog or newsletter. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts, Leah, because it's like a very sort of craft question, and I'm always like obsessed with other people and their process, and, you know, how do you come up with ideas? It's one of the, I think, something we all grapple with, right? So I would love to hear what you have to say.
Oh yeah, it's definitely something that I'm always refining, and has changed so much over time, and definitely that I've gotten a lot more clarity on as I've continued in the field. You know, I think, you know, what you said about sometimes a story has to be written, you know, that is definitely a part of what I do. You know, I have beats that I follow. So there'll be a span of time where I'm, you know, following every update in whether it's a lawsuit or a policy process, or, you know, today I was just thinking about this because, you know, I had my whole work plan for the day, and then I read that, you know, some workplace emergency standards might be released from the Biden administration that would have some impact on food system workers, or maybe would not have an impact on food system workers. And because that's a beat that I've been on for the last, you know, 15 months, that's a story, you know, I'd want to write today. So that changes everything, right? And my work plan goes out the window. But I think it's also, you know, what you said about following your curiosity, that's something that that I'm still working on, and have had to work on, of just my confidence as a reporter, especially as someone who, you know, I didn't go to journalism school. I often feel like I, you know, sort of made up all my ways that I do things, and am learning from Twitter and conversations with other journalists, and, like, you know, writing notes down of everything that everyone says. But you know, having that confidence to say, you know, I think there's something here, and I'm going to pursue it. And actually, you know, one long form story I'm working on now, an earlier iteration of the research happened 2 or 3 years ago, where I thought there's something here and I don't quite know what it is. And I started poking around, and I couldn't figure out how to get into the story. And I was like, all right, you know, I'm going to bench it. And then a news hook came up a couple months ago, and I was like, hey, you know, I'm ready. I can do that story now. I'm ready for it. And I can tackle it with a couple more years of experience and the right news hook. Like, now I have my way in. So I think that's part of it, is like, I'm always gathering string, putting new ideas in the, you know, my elaborate story tracker, and sometimes it's just not the right moment, and the right moment might come later.
Thanks for that. Davida, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I wanted to follow that up. Lily, that was such a great question that you asked Patricia and Leah, in terms of where they get, you know, inspiration in their process, right? For how they find stories, why they write what they write. And my question is to Leah about, and Patricia as well, like, are you all aware that here you all are in the trenches, doing the hard reporting, trying to get the truth out, and then there are lobbyists, there are business groups, there are businesses that are trying to push their own message as well, which could be very, very hard for the consumer to discern, like what really is a PR piece and what really is kind of like a hard-hitting truth piece. And the reason why I bring that up is that this was a conversation that blew up on Twitter between me and my friends. And so, Leah, I wonder if you saw this, and I put it in the chat, but the name of the article, it showed up in the New York Times. This is how important this was to me. You're talking about the newspaper of record. And the title was, "That Salmon on Your Plate Might Have Been a Vegetarian." But that's not the lead is not the real issue. What the real issue is when you scroll down at the very, very bottom of this article, there was an editor's note that was published 2 days later and said, after this article was published, the New York Times learned that the author actually served on the advisory panel of Cargill, and her role was not disclosed and was not displayed. And the chatter was, could the New York Times just hire damn Leah Douglas? Like, we're sick of it. Because the New York Times, if Leah and Patricia can remember, that back in December, the New York Times had actually posted that they were hiring a position for an agribusiness reporter. I don't know if that has been filled yet, but it's obvious, you know, there's some of the articles around food, agribusiness appears to be copy and paste from the industry. And I'm wondering, like, how can consumers discern between, you know, what's been copied and pasted from like the industry and lobbying groups and what's not? Should they just be trying to follow like who the byline is? At least that's how I do it. I want to know who wrote it. And it's you guys, ladies, Patricia, Leah, like Claire, like these are trusted voices that if y'all didn't write it, like I'm like, I take it as a grain of salt. Do you all feel how important you all are and your words are when it comes to food journalism?
No, I really appreciate that, and that's a really important example. That story, I remember when that happened, and you know, the topic of the story around aquaculture is so controversial. I've covered that. That was a beat that I followed for a while, and I'm still sort of following. And it's definitely a more complicated issue than I think a lot of the reporting in big papers lets on. And you know, I think for me, I definitely follow bylines. I mean, I always wonder to what extent, you know, readers do that, or if that's like an industry thing. Like, I'm paying attention. And definitely before I was a journalist, I don't think I thought twice. I feel bad for, I'm like, sorry, everyone that I read. I didn't think about who wrote what. But I think now it's so obvious that, you know, the reporter has so much power, right? I think that's something that sometimes the journalism industry doesn't surface enough or reckon with enough, is like, we're powerful in terms of who we choose to put down on the page. And definitely, I think the big papers can be defensive about critiques that are brought up of that. But, you know, it's true. And it's an important conversation we need to have. I mean, let alone an egregious example like that one, where there was just basic due diligence that didn't happen. And that happens, you know, multiple times a year. But there's also all those soft choices, not soft, but it's sort of baked in choices that are made, right? Who's being quoted, how much gravity is being given to a company statement. You know, I know that I've tweeted about this, which is where I do most of my media criticism, is on Twitter, and about this year of like, when Tyson Foods puts out a statement, okay, now you have Tyson Foods perspective. What can we actually fact check from what's in there, right? And if we can't, we should tell the reader in some way, make it clear that we can't really fact check this information because the company won't share more details. We can't get inside the facility, blah, 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 right? And I think not every single story is going to have the inches and the space or the need to do that. But as a body of work, and definitely as a publication, the way you earn the trust with readers is that people can walk away from your story having that understanding. If people are confused, who wrote this, right? Is this just copy paste from a press release? I don't think, you're not doing your job as a journalist. What do you think, Patricia?
Yeah, first, Davida, you're going to make me cry. That was so beautiful. And yeah, I would like to echo everything Leah said tenfold, and maybe circle back around to what you said, Leah, about having confidence in yourself. At the end of the day, it's your name on that story. It's your byline. And I had a very wise person tell me, a wise journalist tell me, we live and die by our names. And I think because the borders between PR and journalism have gotten, you know, increasingly fuzzy, it feels to me, credibility is more important than ever. You know, there will be times, and I guess I'm speaking to students now or anyone who is maybe getting started in the field, but there will be times where you'll be pressured to write something that maybe feels to you like it's going too easy on someone. Those are the times you really have to, you know, summon that strength and remember that this is your story, and have confidence in your ability as a journalist to understand what the facts are and what the stakes are. I see so much journalism being done that is going really, really soft on some of these players. And it's disappointing because these are, you're right, Leah, there's so much power. There's, you know, speaking truth to power is incredibly resonant, and it cuts through the noise really quickly. So I can't really stress enough what Leah said about having confidence in yourself as a reporter, and that you know what you're doing, because there's going to be so many voices telling you, you know, you're not an expert in this, you're not. But if you did the legwork, and if you did the research, if you did your homework, then, you know, you've earned the right to really, you know, feel confident in your reporting.
I want to piggyback on that with a question from an audience member from Pritam, who's asking, how do you identify the voices that you want to include on a given topic? And how do you have trouble sometimes finding those folks? And how do you approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for that. I think at the beginning of a story, when, you know, it obviously, the obvious answer is it's case by case. It depends on the story. But I think, you know, I usually start out with like an idea of a few types of sources I'd like to get, types of voices I'd like to get. So if I'm writing a story about labor, I know I want to have, you know, a perspective of a worker, perspective of a union, or if it's there, an advocacy group, perspective of the employer, maybe a regulatory office, somebody that oversees, you know, whatever the thing is that people are talking about in the story, and then sort of expand from there, depending on how complicated the story is. I mean, some stories that's enough, other stories needs a lot more context. You know, definitely it's a huge hurdle it's always disappointing when we can't access certain types of voices. You know, I mean, for instance, this year when I was reporting a lot on the meatpacking industry, you know, I would absolutely love to have more access to the folks who work at those companies, you know, to ask questions, learn more about what's going on behind the scenes, why are decisions being made. I mean, you know, I often end up with sort of just a company statement. That's what most reporters end up with from companies like that. And I don't think it's limited just to food, you know, that's sort of a corporate strategy. And it's unfortunate because the reader could learn, the public could learn so much more if we were able to get inside those companies. And of course, you know, that's some of the most revelatory work that happens in investigative journalism, is getting behind those closed doors. You know, from the other side, it can also be disappointing to not be able to access government workers, government agencies, public agencies. That was another hurdle I faced in reporting on COVID, and it's sort of an ongoing issue is, you know, even if there is a PR contact on the website, you know, it's not always a guarantee that agency is going to make people available, which is always a shame, especially for, you know, public sector workers. So, you know, I think in those cases, I do my best to cobble together what I think is a good representation of the perspective, the voice of the direct source I might be missing. You know, it's always helpful to have reports, you know, research, other reporting, data, you know, all those things are helpful if, you know, there's not a specific source available, but you can sort of flesh out the context around that source.
Thanks for that perspective. We just have a couple minutes left. I see a couple more questions in the chat box. I want to invite back Davida and Andy as well, if you want to come back and turn on your cameras. All right, that was quick. So Davida and Andy, do you have any kind of wrap-up questions or remarks? And if we have a minute, there's two more questions we might be able to get to.
I'm happy to default to the questions in the chat unless Davida has any comments or questions.
No, I'm happy to default to the questions in the chat as well to bring more voices into the conversation. I just put in the chat because I think is so super important to not only support Patricia and Leah, but the outlets that they work for, the counter and the firm and other independently owned media outlets that cover food at the intersection. Another one that comes to mind that I absolutely love is Civil Eats, which also does great reporting. I'm in the Midwest. Well, we're in the Midwest. We're in Michigan, and I'll just have to say increasingly Big Ag is financing agricultural news in the Midwest. And they're doing that to fill the void of shrinking local news coverage. You guys see what's happening to our local newspapers. And to fill that void, a lot of times these large industry companies are actually paying for Big Ag news. So we have to support our independently owned news sources that's really doing a great job of getting some really hard-hitting reporting out there. So that was just my only last and final statement.
Davida, that's too bad that's your last and final statement, because you always have a way of like having this zinger one-liner at the end that I love to leave everybody with. So I was hoping you might come in with one of those again this time. But I just want to acknowledge, I don't think we're going to have time to get to them, but I do want to just acknowledge the other topics that have been brought up for folks to know they're wondering about. It sounds like we have one from Becca who just wants to continue that conversation about prisons and food in prisons itself, which can be really unhealthy and, as she says, deplorable and inadequate. And so she's interested in diving deeper into that. We also got another comment from somebody in the chat who is interested in diving more into topics of sexual harassment and reckoning in craft beer industry that come up. Sorry, Natalie, I don't think we have time to dive into that, but we see you. And someone else who's wants to talk even more about that balance that we discussed a bit about drilling down on technical details and also zooming out into the larger framework to make something accessible. And I know we did cover some of that, but there's plenty to talk about there for sure. So I just want to thank everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you. If this is your first food literacy, welcome. I know some of you come every week or every month or week when it's in person. Some of you are always here online. Some of you always come in our doors in the Angel Hall in Ann Arbor in person. So thank you for being a part of this. We are hoping we'll see how the world goes. We're hoping to be back in person next year, back on campus. And I just want to thank our panelists and my cohort team, Davida and Andy. You guys have been awesome.
Thanks, Lily. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Patricia. Thanks, Leah. More than anything, not only am I so glad that you both ladies were able to join us, but I'm so happy that you all were connected to each other. So I'm just going to put it out in the world. Hopefully one day we might see a collaboration between the two of you. And I would love to see that happen, because I think that you both are just amazing. I continue to follow your work and to be informed. So thank you so much for joining us, Patricia and Leah, and thanks to my colleagues and comrade, Lily and Andy. Thank you so much. This was the last one. I'm gonna miss you guys.
I know. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thank you so much.
Take care.